In our paper, we studied the relationship between the long-term evolution of men's and women's working hour on the one hand, and the process of economic development on the other hand. And we do that through the lens of structural transformation. And by structural transformation, we mean the process of labor reallocation through the broad sectors of agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So in the paper, we build a consistent series of men's and women's working hour over the past 1.5 centuries in the US, with a special emphasis on the measurement of women's unpaid work in family businesses, mostly family farm, in the pre-1940 period. So one of the main facts that we establish is that the evolution of female work was non-monotonic along the process of economic development. In particular, female participation and female hours were falling up until mid-20th century, and then they were rising again in the second part of the century. The initial decline in female hours was entirely associated with the decline in agriculture, and in particular the decline in family farms, which used to be in the early days the main employer of female work. And then the second phase, the phase of increased female hours and female participation, was accounted for to some extent by the rise of the service economy. So the service economy was creating jobs that were believed to be female-friendly, more female-friendly, for example, than manufacturing jobs, because initially they required less physical strength than manufacturing, they were cleaner, they were believed to be more appropriate for women. So this explains part of the rise in female participation in the second half of the 20th century. By contrast, for men, the initial decline in men's hours is accounted for, again, by the decline in agriculture, which is not entirely offset by the increase in manufacturing. And in the second half of the period, the further decline in men's hours are accounted for by the process of deindustrialization, which, again, is not entirely offset by the growth in services. So we thought that this historical perspective gives us important insight, not just for the understanding of long-run trends, which of course are important in their own right, but also to understand the cross-sectional variation in the industry structure and female participation around the world these days, and in particular to understand the experiences of many developing countries around the world currently, because many of these countries are going through phases of agricultural decline, and the initial phase of agricultural decline is typically also accompanied by a decline in female participation. So one would expect that the US experience over 1.5 centuries would help us understand the transition out of agriculture of developing countries these days, with of course a lot of nuances and specificities that depend on a completely different historical era. So for example, in countries like China and India, the recent decline in agriculture has been accompanied by a decline in female participation. So our model, our analysis gives insight onto, for example, the role of governments in helping this transition out of agriculture, stimulating the growth in services, and also removing the kind of frictions that would provide, for example, obstacles to the exit of women from agriculture and the entry of women into the service sector. So, for example, technology adoption in agriculture, technology adoption in market services, removal of institutional or cultural barriers that prevent the movement of women from the production of services in the home to the production of services in the market. I think that the understanding and the study of gender inequalities is quite important in economics, and indeed it has attracted increasing attention in many subfields of economics, not just in labor, for example. And one reason why economists believe that this has become really an important issue, it's because this is not simply an issue of social justice, of inequality, but it might also be an issue of allocative efficiency. So if there are barriers to the entry of women in certain occupations, in certain professions, then it means that perhaps we are not using female talent in the best possible way. And the symmetric argument, of course, can also be made for men. If there are cultural barriers to the entry of men into certain female-dominated occupations, then perhaps it means that we're not using male talent in the best possible way. So starting from this premise and also starting from the previous work on gender that I did with my co-authors, Rachel Guy and Claudia Olivetti, we thought that really for the understanding of the evolution of gender inequalities to the place where we are now, we really need to understand the transition from very early societies in which women were very heavily involved in the economy, especially in agriculture, through to, say, the mid-century phase that created this kind of model family of breadwinner husband and homemaker women, and then again to the more modern family with two participating spouses, in which, however, there are important inequalities, remaining inequalities between men and women. So this again would be a matter of social justice and equity, but also may improve the allocative efficiency of the economy.